The dead frequency spoke first. That was the part Lieutenant Ren Ashak could not explain to her commanding officer. Not the ship, not the transponder, the frequency itself. It had been decommissioned 312 years ago, stripped from every active database, buried under layers of updated communication protocols. Nothing should have been able to broadcast on it, nothing alive anyway. She had been running a standard deep field sweep when the signal hit her console like a stone dropped in still water. One clean pulse, then a repeating pattern. She ran it through the translation stack 3 times before she accepted what she was reading. An Earth vessel identification code. Old format. Pre-expansion era. The kind of code used when humanity still measured interstellar distance in years and considered 2 inhabited star systems to be an empire. She flagged it quietly. She did not want to be wrong about this in front of anyone. The Velrani patrol cruiser Steadfast Hand was 3 hours into a routine boundary sweep, which meant the crew was bored and looking for reasons to be somewhere else. Ren had 40 minutes left on her shift. She spent 39 of those minutes cross-referencing the signal against every archive she could access, and in the 40th minute she found the match. UES Perseverance, Earth Registry, Crew Complement 312, declared lost with all hands in the year that the Velrani Compact still recorded as the 8th year of the Amber Council, which everyone else called 3 centuries ago. Last known position, the outer boundary of the Dorkai Survey Corridor, near a region all long-range probes had always returned as empty void. She sent the flag up the chain. Her commanding officer, a senior patrol captain named Das, came to her station and looked at her screen for a long time without speaking. Then he looked at the coordinates the signal was coming from. Then he looked at her. She said, "I checked it 4 times, sir." He said, "Get me a visual." The visual took 11 minutes to resolve. The Steadfast Hand was not a long-range sensor platform. It was a border patrol vessel built for stopping smugglers and logging anomalies, not for staring into the deep dark and pulling shapes out of radiation noise. But it managed. Slowly. The shape on the screen built itself pixel by pixel, and when it was done, the bridge was very quiet. The silhouette matched. Old hull design. Compact by modern standards. Nacelle configuration that no shipyard had produced in 280 years. The ship was dark except for running lights which were on, which meant someone had turned them on, which meant the crew knew they were visible and did not care. Ren sent the visual to Velrani Fleet Command with a brief attached note. Possible identification of pre-expansion Earth vessel. Recommend immediate senior response. The senior response arrived in 40 minutes. 4 Velrani cruisers, 1 heavy command ship, and a direct line to High Admiral Sora herself, who asked 2 questions in rapid succession from her command deck 12 light hours away. First, is it armed? Second, is it moving? Ren answered both, yes and no. The weapons on the Perseverance were charged, not powering up, already hot. The targeting array was active and locked onto every vessel in range simultaneously, updating in real time as new ships arrived. It was doing this automatically, with no visible change in crew activity. The ship itself sat completely still. The first transmission came 40 minutes after Fleet Command arrived. A human voice, female, unhurried, the kind of voice that had decided long ago not to waste energy on alarm. It said, "This is UES Perseverance out of Earth, registry number PE7741. We have returned. We are aware of your weapons. We want you to be aware of ours. Stand down your targeting and we will stand down ours. We have no interest in a fight today. We have been traveling a long time and we would like to dock somewhere comfortable. You may respond when ready." A pause. Then, "We are patient. But we should mention, we have been patient for 300 years. Our definition of the word is different from yours." The fleet held its position. No one fired, no one stood down either. Ren was still at her console, running secondary scans, when she found the detail she had not been looking for. She ran it twice, the way she had run the original signal. Then she sat very still for a moment. The Perseverance's mass reading was wrong. Not slightly wrong, catastrophically wrong. The ship on the screen matched the old hull specifications in every external dimension, but its mass was 11 times what it should be. Something was inside it, something that weighed as much as a small moon packed into the cargo hold of a 3-century-old survey ship. She attached the reading to her report and sent it upward. She added one line at the bottom: "Whatever they brought back, it is larger than the ship that is carrying it. I do not know how that is possible. I am not sure it should be." She hit send. Somewhere in the dark ahead of her, the Perseverance's running lights burned steady and calm, as if the ship had never been gone at all. Nobody warned Ambassador Rule that the ship smelled different. He had prepared for everything else. He had reviewed every scrap of pre-expansion human diplomatic protocol the Assembly archives held. He had briefed himself on the Perseverance's mission logs, the ones that ended abruptly 3 centuries ago mid-sentence in the navigator's personal record. He had prepared opening remarks in 3 languages, including Old Standard English, which his aide had spent 2 days reconstructing from historical files. He had not prepared for the smell. It was not unpleasant, not chemical or mechanical the way most ships smelled. It was something older, like stone after rain, like deep earth, like a place sealed for a very long time that had developed its own air. Rule stepped through the airlock and tried not to show that anything was wrong. The woman waiting did not help. She leaned against the corridor wall with her arms folded, watching him the way a border guard watches someone whose documents are technically in order but whose face is not. Not in a formal uniform. Shipboard working clothes, worn at the elbows, with a sidearm she had not bothered to conceal. She looked mid-30s. She looked like she had been mid-30s for a long time and had made her peace with it. She said, "Ambassador," not a greeting, a confirmation. He said, "I am. I represent the Galactic Assembly and come in the spirit of." "Captain will see you in 10 minutes, she said. "Don't touch anything. Don't open closed doors. Don't ask the crew questions. They answer honestly and some answers are upsetting." She turned and walked, and he understood he was meant to follow. The crew he passed in the corridors were wrong in a way that took him several minutes to name. It was not their appearance, though they were all notably young-looking for a ship supposedly 300 years in service. It was how they moved. There was no wasted motion anywhere. They did not glance at him the way crew members always glanced at visitors, that quick assessment of rank and purpose. They looked at him the way experienced soldiers looked at a new variable in a familiar equation. Measured. Already filed away. They communicated in fragments. He passed 2 engineers in a side corridor having what appeared to be a complete conversation in 9 words total. Both of them nodded and separated without another syllable, both already moving to whatever the 9 words had decided. Rule's aide sent him a private earpiece note. Biosigns on crew read fully human, but cellular age markers are inconsistent with their apparent age by a factor of approximately 8 to 1. He filed that away and kept walking. The conference room had been converted. Every surface had material on it. Charts that were not navigation charts. Diagrams that might have been biological or mathematical or something that had no category yet. Writing in at least 4 scripts he did not recognize at all. The woman who had escorted him, Sergeant Petra Dahl, his aide confirmed from crew records, stood by the door and said nothing else for the rest of the meeting. Captain Adara Vaughn was already in the room. She was seated, reviewing something on a handheld screen, and she finished reading before she looked up. Not rudeness, more like someone who had learned not to let anything go half-finished. She looked about 35. The crew records said she had been 34 when the ship launched. She offered him a drink. He accepted. She poured it from a container that looked handmade. The drink was human in origin, something warm and bitter he could not identify. He delivered his opening remarks, all 3 language variants. He was proud of the old standard English especially. She listened without expression. When he finished, she set down her cup. She said, "Ambassador, the Assembly sent its best diplomat, which means they are taking this seriously, which means they are frightened. That is a reasonable response. Here is what I want you to take back to them. We are not returning as refugees. We are not returning as a curiosity. We are returning as a party to an agreement that involves something the galaxy did not know existed 3 weeks ago and is only beginning to understand now. We would like updated terms for humanity's participation in galactic affairs. We would like those terms to reflect what we have brought back and what we know. You may begin your questions." He asked the question, the one he had been told not to ask by 3 different senior Assembly officials, each of whom had emphasized it in a different way. "Captain, what did you find out there?" Vaughn looked at him. Then she looked at Dahl by the door. Something moved between them that had no name in any diplomatic lexicon he knew. 3 centuries of shared experience passing in a single glance. Then Vaughn said, quietly, like it was a simple fact, "Something that agreed to come back with us." The ship shuddered. One deep movement through the hull, low and resonant like a sound felt more than heard. Not mechanical, not turbulence. Like something very large and very aware had just shifted its weight. Rule did not move. He had spent 40 years in diplomacy training himself not to react to surprises, but his hand, resting on the table, pressed flat against the surface without him telling it to, as if some part of him had decided it needed to feel something solid. Vaughn watched him with something that might have been sympathy. She said, "You get used to it, mostly." 3 days after the Perseverance appeared, Counselor Hayne forgot how to sleep. He had been humanity's voice in the Galactic Assembly for 11 years. He had navigated trade disputes, border negotiations, 2 near wars that history would probably forget because he had made sure they ended in conference rooms instead of vacuum. He was good at his job because he understood that information was always incomplete and that good decisions were ones you could still defend when the rest of the information arrived. He did not know what to do when the information was arriving from a direction he had never accounted for. The emergency session was already into its 2nd day. 212 seats across 42 species, every one of them occupied for the first time in Haynes' career. That alone told him everything about the temperature of the room. The Dorkai representative, Senior Delegate Aura, had the floor when Hayne arrived. 300 years old, political instincts sharp as anything the galaxy had tried to blunt. She was calling for immediate impoundment, quarantine, full crew examination, seizure of the cargo. She had been speaking for 40 minutes. When Haynes' turn came, he stood up with no prepared remarks. He said, "I was not told they were coming back. I was not told what they found. I know nothing more than you do, and I want to be clear about that because I understand the impulse to assume humanity has been running a 300-year strategy in secret, and that impulse would be flattering if it were true." A pause. "What I know is this. The crew survived 3 centuries in contact with something none of us knew existed. They came back voluntarily and announced themselves instead of simply arriving without warning, which their weapons capability suggests they could have done at a time of their choosing. They chose to knock. Decisions have reasons. I suggest we find out the reason before we pass resolutions about impoundment." Aura said, in a tone that had ended careers, "On what basis does he recommend trust for a ship that has not explained itself?" Haynes said, "On the basis that they have not fired yet." That landed in the silence the way he intended. 12 light towers away, the conversation he did not know about was happening. Dr. Os Nkrumah moved through the Perseverance's lower deck with 2 crew members behind him and a handheld sensor he no longer fully trusted. He had stopped fully trusting his instruments around year 40 of the voyage. They still gave readings. The readings were still technically accurate. They simply could not capture what they were pointing at, the way a cup could accurately measure how full it was while failing entirely to describe the ocean it was trying to quantify. The cargo hold door required a 6-point manual authorization to open. That was not the original design. They had added it in year 60, after the second incident, after they understood that what was inside had preferences about when and whether the door opened, and that honoring those preferences was both polite and more practically wise. Osei pressed his palm to the final pad. The door opened. The hold was not dark. It provided its own light, a low, shifting quality of illumination that had no visible source and changed color the way deep water changed color at different depths. The structure filled the space from floor to ceiling and wall to wall, but calling it a structure was like calling a forest a collection of sticks. It had grown. Over 3 centuries it had grown, slowly and with clear intention, until it occupied every available space perfectly without touching a single critical system, which was not an accident. It understood the ship. It had understood the ship for a very long time. Osei placed his hand against the nearest surface, warm, always warm, the way a living thing was warm. It pulsed once under his hand, recognition, greeting. After 300 years he could read its moods the way a man reads weather. He said quietly, "We are home. We told them we would come back and we did." The light in the hold shifted slightly warmer. His crew member closest to the door, a woman named Sable who had been 11 years old when the ship got lost and was now biologically 23 and chronologically 323, said in a low voice, "It's been listening to the communications. The assembly feeds, all of it." Osei said, "I know." Sable said, "Is it going to do something?" Osei considered the structure under his hand, the slow, warm pulse of it, the patience that had no floor and no ceiling. 3 centuries of watching and waiting and learning, and he still could not see the bottom of what it was. He said, "It will do something when it decides the moment is right. That is what it has always done." He took his hand away. Somewhere 13 light towers distant, in the Galactic Assembly Chamber, a new signal request was entering the system from an unregistered broadcast point. Not a ship, not a station, from a location that sensor platforms kept insisting was empty space. The signal was addressed to every device in the chamber simultaneously, in 42 languages, without a translator. It said in each language perfectly, "I am listening, continue." The Dorkai Empire's demand for a demonstration arrived as a formal document, 40 pages long, stamped with 17 official seals. Vaughn read it in 4 minutes, set it down, and said to Osei, "They want proof." Osei said, "Of which part?" "All of it." He was quiet a moment. Then, "Did you ask?" "I did not need to ask." He understood. After 300 years, neither of them needed to say the full thing. She had not asked because the answer had already been given, not in words but in the way the hold lights had shifted when the assembly communications came through. It was paying attention. It had opinions. And it was ready. Vaughn sent back a 4-line response to the 40-page demand. She named coordinates. She named a time. One condition: every vessel present would lower its weapons before arrival. No exceptions. The assembly deliberated for 15 hours. Then they agreed. The coordinates were 90 light minutes from the nearest inhabited system. Empty space, which was the point. What was going to happen there should happen where it could not damage anything unless it chose to. 37 ships arrived. Every major power. Velrani heavy cruisers, Dorkai command ships, a dozen assembly observer vessels, several species that had no military presence at all but sent civilian ships anyway because they had understood, somehow, that this was something you needed to see with your own instruments. Every ship lowered weapons on arrival as agreed. The Perseverance did not. Nobody said anything about that. Vaughn's voice came over open frequency without preamble. She did not introduce herself. Every ship there knew who was speaking. She said, 307 years ago this vessel crossed into a region your best science had marked as empty. That region was not empty. What lives there cannot be described in the terms any of you currently have available. We spent 2 centuries being examined by it and 1 century reaching an agreement with it. What you are about to see is the opening statement of that agreement, translated into something your instruments can measure. Please observe. Please record everything. You will want the records. She stopped transmitting. For 60 seconds nothing happened. Every ship ran their sensors and found nothing new. Some of the fleet commanders later admitted privately they thought it was finished, that the humans had overpromised something that was not going to appear, and they were already composing their reports about the anticlimax. Then the cargo hold of the Perseverance opened. Not the exterior bay doors the way a ship released cargo. The whole rear section of the hull simply parted, smoothly, as if the material had decided to become something other than a wall. What came out did not come out the way objects came out of ships. It unfolded. That was the word every report used from every species, independently. Unfolded. As if it had been compressed into the Perseverance like a map folded into a pocket, now being spread across a table the size of open space. It extended in directions that sensors captured but eyes struggled to follow. It occupied more space than the ship had contained it in, and that fact appeared to create no contradiction it was concerned about. It was not a shape, it was a process, something happening continuously rather than something that existed statically. High Admiral Sara of the Velrani fleet said one word to her bridge crew: hold. They held. What happened next took 40 seconds. Every sensor platform in the area recorded it at maximum resolution. Later, scientists from 9 species would spend years analyzing the recordings and agree on the mechanics while continuing to disagree on the meaning. The entity reached, not physically, not with any appendage or extension anyone could point to. It reached into the structure of local space the way a hand reached into water, and it wrote. Not in radiation, not in energy fields, in the fabric of spacetime itself, in the geometry of the space between the ships, in something that should not have been writable. Every sensor read it. Every translation system in every ship converted it without hesitation, as if it had already learned every language present and had been waiting for the right moment. It said, in the native language of every species simultaneously. The ones you call humans introduced us. We have decided to be introduced. We are watching. We are curious. We are patient. We recommend you treat them accordingly. Then it folded back into the Perseverance. The hull sealed behind it without a seam, and the ship sat in the dark as if nothing unusual had occurred. The 37 ships did not retreat on order. There were no orders. The fleet commanders were still reading the message when their crews began moving. Hands on controls without being told. Ships rotating, drives warming, the collective body of the galactic military presence in that region putting distance between itself and the Perseverance with a speed that no drill had ever achieved. Sara watched her bridge empty toward stations. She watched the fleet pull back on her screens. She did not stop them. She said to no one in particular, well, now we know why they came back. On the Perseverance, Vaughn watched the retreating fleets on the main screen. Osai stood beside her. Neither of them spoke for a while. Then Osai said, that was shorter than I expected. Vaughn said, it was precise, it does not waste. She pulled up a chart on her private screen, the one she had not shown anyone. 40 coordinates, each marking a region of space similar to where they had spent 3 centuries. 40 regions. 1 entity found. 39 unknown. She said quietly, the galaxy thinks this is the end of something. It is not. Osai looked at the chart and said nothing, because he already knew. The docking arm of Anchor Point Station reached out and locked onto the Perseverance with a mechanical clunk that echoed through the hull. And Yusuf al-Rashid, standing in the forward corridor, felt something move in his chest that he had not felt in a very long time. He was the youngest senior officer on the ship. He had been 22 when the Perseverance launched. He was biologically 29 now. He was chronologically 331 years old, which was a number his mind had given up trying to process around year 200, and had since simply accepted as a feature of the situation. What moved in his chest was not relief. It was not joy. It was something quieter. The recognition of something he had been holding at a distance for 3 centuries, because feeling it at full weight would have made it impossible to function. He had not known if there would be anything left to come home to. There was. The station was enormous and lit up and full of human beings, and he could see them through the observation windows as the docking sequence completed. Just ordinary people moving through ordinary corridors doing ordinary things. And Yusuf had to look away after a moment because it was too much and he had too much to do. The crew of the Perseverance moved through the docking integration process, and the other humans on the station found reasons to stay clear of them. Not out of hostility. Something subtler. People moved aside in corridors and then stood a little further away than they needed to. Conversations in nearby rooms went quieter. Children, who had no filter for the thing that adults were feeling and suppressing, stared openly and said things their parents immediately hushed. Sergeant Dahl noticed all of it. She cataloged it. She said to Von later, in the direct way she said most things, "Our own people are spooked." Von said, "We are different." Dahl said, "We were always different." Von said, "Now they can see it." What had happened in the void could not be undone. The entity had not changed them with surgical precision. It had simply been with them for 3 centuries, filling the background of everything with its presence, and they had adapted until the adaptation became them. So gradually that none of them had noticed the moment they stopped being the people who had left Earth and became the people who had survived. They did not jump at sudden sounds. They did not startle. They could sit in complete silence for hours without discomfort. They read every room they walked into with speed that went beyond training. They had learned to read something truly unknowable for 300 years, and that skill did not switch off when the thing they were reading changed. It was useful. It was also unsettling to anyone who had not been there. Yusuf found a public information terminal on level 4 of the docking hub, sat down, and began reading. He read for 4 hours, not quickly. He went through major historical events of the past 3 centuries in order, cross-referencing, checking dates, reading original sources when available. Wars he had not seen, cities that had not existed when he left, technologies built on foundations laid after his ship had gone. The slow, long story of what everything had done while he was somewhere else being preserved in amber. He found Earth in the records and spent an additional hour there. At some point in the 3rd hour he stopped and sat still for 30 seconds. Whatever happened in that time, he did not share it with anyone nearby. When he finished, he opened a blank document and wrote for 40 minutes without stopping. He titled it, "We Missed You. We are glad it still exists." He saved it to a public archive with open access and no author name and walked away. Meanwhile, Petra Dahl had not left the ship. She trusted anchor points and stations in the same way she trusted most things, which was precisely as far as necessity required. She ran her standard security sweeps of the docking connections, logged everything, reviewed the external sensor feeds, and on the 3rd pass noticed something that stopped her in place. A communication had entered the Perseverance's old broadcast buffer, not the current one, the original one, running on the same dead frequency that had announced their return, the one that should have been receiving nothing because nothing should have known it existed. The message was short. It had no origin tag that resolved to any known location. It had no sender identification of any kind. When she ran it through translation, it said, "We heard the announcement. We have been waiting for you to return. When you are ready, there is more to show you." She stood in the communications bay and read it a second time, then a third. The message was patient in the way the original entity was patient, but it was not the same. Different texture, different quality, like the difference between one voice and another voice that had learned to speak from the same teacher. She flagged it and went to find Vaughn. Vaughn read the message and her expression did not change. She sat with it for a moment. Then she pulled up her private star chart, the one with 40 coordinates marked, and looked at it for a long time. She said, "Something in one of the other regions has been monitoring galactic communications long enough to know we left, and are now tracking that we came back." Dahl said, "Is that concerning?" Vaughn said, "That depends entirely on what it wants." She looked at the chart. "But it reached out instead of arriving. That is a kind of courtesy." She paused. "We should write back." The last thing the galaxy expected was for Adara Vaughn to be boring. She had no prepared speech. She walked to the podium of the full assembly session, 212 seats filled for the second time in a week, and stood there a moment just reading the room. What was afraid? What was ambitious? What was simply waiting to see which way the current ran? Then she spoke plainly. She said, "There are 43 regions in this galaxy your combined science has mapped as empty. They are not empty. We found one. We spent 300 years in it. We made contact, we made an agreement, and we came back. That is not the unusual part." She paused. "The unusual part is that we identified 42 more regions identical in profile to the one we entered. Each is almost certainly occupied. Each occupant has existed longer than any civilization in this room. We do not know if they are all patient. We do not know if they are all inclined toward agreements." She let that land. "We need ships, resources, personnel willing to go to places from which they may not return for a very long time. In exchange, we will share everything we know, every method we developed, every language fragment we recorded, every technique that kept 312 people functional in conditions that should have destroyed them inside a year. This is the offer, real terms open to negotiation. Except one." Senior Delegate Aura said, "Which one?" Vaughn said, "Humanity leads the expeditions. We have been there and you have not. In an environment where ignorance gets everyone killed, experience is not something you vote on." The chamber erupted, which was expected. Vaughn stood at the podium and waited. She had learned patience in a place that made 3 centuries feel like a reasonable amount of time, and the assembly's noise lasted approximately 8 minutes, which was, by comparison, nothing. When the room came down, Councillor Hayne called for the vote. It was not a clean vote. It was never going to be a clean vote. The Dorkai bloc voted against as a bloc. 11 smaller species abstained, but the middle of the assembly held, and the critical swing came from a single voice. High Admiral Sora submitted her vote in written record rather than by signal, which was unusual. With it she submitted a statement of 3 sentences that every outlet in the galaxy would republish before the day was out. She wrote, "I have spent 40 years building strategies for threats this galaxy did not have names for yet. These humans have spent 300 years learning to speak to one of them. Whatever your politics, that is not something you throw away out of pride." The motion passed. Anchor Point's docking arm released the Perseverance 6 hours later. A formation of 8 ships from 5 different species formed up as escort, none of them military, all of them representing something more complicated than military. The gesture of an institution that had just voted to trust something it did not fully understand yet. Yusuf al-Rashid stood at the bow observation deck as the station fell behind. He watched it get smaller. He had spent his 6 hours at the station reading, and then writing, and then standing at an observation window watching people who did not know he was watching them, trying to absorb what 300 years of human activity looked like from the outside. Osa Nkrumah came to stand beside him. They were quiet for a while. The stars ahead were the kind of dents that only happened at the edge of explored space. Osai said, "Are you afraid?" Yusuf thought about it. He gave it the honest consideration it deserved, which was something the 3 centuries had taught him, that questions worth asking were worth actually answering. He said, "Of what is out there. No, I have seen what is out there. It is worth seeing." He watched a distant star track slowly across the glass. "I am afraid of how long we will be gone this time." Osei said, "Me too." He was quiet for a moment, but we wrote back. Yusuf nodded. They had written back to the message on the dead frequency. A short reply, careful wording that Vaughn had drafted and Osei had reviewed and Dahl had read 3 times, looking for tactical vulnerabilities, which was how she processed hope. The reply said, "We received your message. We are coming. Please be patient. We have found that patience travels well." In the cargo hold, the structure pulsed, slow and steady. The lights shifted warm the way they always did when it was content. It had heard the new message. It had been present for the vote. It had, in its own way, approved, which they could tell because the ship ran 7% more efficiently when it approved of something, a correlation Osei had documented in year 104. The Perseverance accelerated toward the outer edge of mapped space. 30 light-years beyond the galaxy's rim, something vast and unhurried felt the approach the way a deep ocean felt a boat on its surface. It had waited a long time. It had listened to the announcement. It had read the message. It had been for a very long time alone. It moved toward them, not to stop them, not to test them. Simply to see what they did when they arrived. It had a feeling it would be interesting.